I dream about your curvy body, the mountain man declared to the obese beggar. On a frozen frontier street, a starving woman is mocked and pushed aside until a rugged loner speaks words no one expected. His vow stuns the town, but what begins as a scandal soon turns into something far greater. Inside a cabin lit by firelight, mercy sparks hope. Yet danger waits in the shadows. A powerful railroad foreman claims the creek that keeps them alive, and he's holding forged papers to prove it. The beggar carries secrets of her own, bound to a husband's past mistakes, secrets that could destroy the only man who ever defended her. As blizzards close in and enemies tighten their grip, will a broken widow and a grieving mountain man find redemption in each other? Or will the railroad's greed tear apart the only chance they have at love and survival? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The icy wind cut through Hetty Mae's thin shawls as she huddled against the general store's wooden wall. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and her feet had long since gone numb from standing in the snow. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Bluff's main street, offering little warmth to her shivering frame. "Still here, are you?" The storekeeper's voice dripped with disdain as he swept his porch. "Ain't got no use for beggars, especially ones eating more than their share." Cruel laughter rippled through the small crowd of townsfolk gathering their evening supplies. Hetty wrapped her arms tighter around herself, trying to make her curvy frame smaller to disappear into the weathered boards behind her. Shame burned hot on her cheeks despite the biting cold. "Look at the size of her," a woman whispered loudly to her companion. "Could feed half the town on what she must eat." Tears froze on Hetty's cheeks. Since her husband's death, she'd endured their taunts, but today the cold and hunger had worn her spirit particularly thin. The storekeeper advanced toward her, broom raised like a weapon. "Get on now. You're bad for business. That's enough." The deep voice cut through the bitter wind like a knife. The crowd parted as Theo Boone stepped forward, his broad shoulders wrapped in a bearskin coat, boots leaving heavy prints in the fresh snow. Hetty had seen him before, the mountain man who came to town every few weeks for supplies, but they'd never spoken. His dark eyes swept over the gathered faces, challenging anyone to meet his gaze. When no one did, he turned to Hetty, and something in his expression softened. "I dream about your curvy body," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and I won't see it wasted to hunger." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The storekeeper's broom clattered to the wooden porch. Hetty's heart thundered in her chest, unsure whether to feel mortified or grateful for this strange defense. Without another word, Theo strode into the store. Through the window, Hetty watched him gather supplies, a loaf of fresh bread, salt pork, and other essentials. When he emerged, he walked straight to her, his arms full of provisions. "Here," he said quietly, placing the food in her trembling hands. The bread was still warm, and the scent made her dizzy with hunger. Before she could stammer out a thank you, he bent down and scooped her up as if she weighed nothing at all. A small squeak of surprise escaped her lips as he carried her to his waiting sleigh. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he settled her carefully on the seat, tucking thick fur blankets around her. The horses stamped impatiently, their breath creating clouds in the frosty air. Hetty clutched the food to her chest, her mind whirling. This couldn't be happening. Any moment now, she'd wake up in her cold corner behind the livery stable. "Sir," she managed to whisper as Theo climbed up beside her. I don't owe you anything for this. I can't." "Name's Theo," he interrupted, gathering the reins. "And I ain't buying you, Miss Hetty Mae, just refusing to let you starve." Her eyes widened. "You know my name?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Been watching you for a while, seeing how folks treat you. Ain't right?" The sleigh lurched forward, bells jingling as the horses picked up speed. Hetty glanced back at the dumbfounded faces of the townsfolk growing smaller behind them. The storekeeper still stood frozen on his porch, broom forgotten in the snow. As they left Pine Bluff behind, the wind grew fiercer, but Hetty barely felt it under the thick furs. The sleigh runners cut smooth tracks through the fresh powder as they climbed into the hills. Shadows lengthened across the pristine white landscape, and the first stars began to peek through breaks in the clouds. "My cabin's up ahead," Theo said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "It ain't much, but it's warm and dry." Hetty's fingers found a loose thread in her shawl, twisting it nervously. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Boone?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Because every soul deserves dignity, and because I've seen how hard you try, even when folks are cruel. You don't complain, don't strike back. Just keep your head high and do what needs doing." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time from a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fur blankets. It had been so long since anyone had seen her, really seen her, as more than just a burden or an object of ridicule. The horses picked their way carefully up the snowy trail as darkness settled over the Colorado highlands. Through the gathering dusk, Hetty caught glimpses of towering pines laden with snow, their branches reaching up to a sky now filled with stars. The air grew sharper, cleaner somehow. Up here, away from town. "I can cook," she blurted suddenly, needing him to know she wasn't entirely useless. "And so, I can earn my keep." Theo's hands were steady on the reins as he guided the team around a bend. "You don't have to earn the right to eat, Miss Hetty, or to be warm, or to be treated with respect." Fresh tears froze on her cheeks, but Hetty didn't try to wipe them away. Each word he spoke seemed to chip away at the walls of shame she'd built around herself over the years. The weight of countless cruel comments and dismissive glances began to lift, just a little, from her shoulders. The sleigh crested a rise, and suddenly Hetty caught sight of a cabin nestled against the mountainside. Warm light spilled from its windows, and smoke curled from the stone chimney into the darkening sky. It looked like something from a dream, a haven in the wilderness. "Welcome home," Theo said softly, bringing the horses to a stop. "For as long as you want to stay." Hetty looked at him in the starlight, this rough mountain man with gentle eyes who had defended her honor in front of the whole town, who had seen worth in her when everyone else saw waste, who had offered her not just food and shelter, but dignity. The horses' breath fogged the air as they waited patiently in their traces. Evening shadows had fully claimed the valley below, but up here, in this moment, Hetty May felt as though she could finally see clearly for the first time in years. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight she was warm. She was safe. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was treated as someone who mattered. The cabin door creaked open on well-oiled hinges, releasing a wave of blessed warmth that made Hetty's frozen cheeks tingle. Theo guided her over the threshold with a gentle hand at her elbow, steadying her steps after the long sleigh ride. The single room before her glowed with welcoming lamplight, and a fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth that took up most of the far wall. "Mind your step there," Theo said, helping her navigate past a stack of split logs. "Floor can be uneven for folks not used to it." Hetty stood just inside the door, overwhelmed by the simple comfort surrounding her. The rich scent of wood smoke filled her lungs, mingled with the sharp tang of pine and something else. A hint of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. After months of sleeping in whatever shelter she could find, the very act of being inside felt like an undeserved luxury. The cabin was modest but meticulously maintained. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt occupied one corner. A pine table with 2 chairs stood in another. Shelves lined with books, jars, and tools covered the walls. Everything had its place, speaking to the ordered life of a man accustomed to living alone. "Let me get that fire built up proper," Theo said, moving to stack more logs on the flames. "You'll want to warm through after being out in that wind so long." Hetty clutched her thin shawl tighter, though she hardly needed it now. "I don't mean to be a bother," she whispered. Theo straightened from the hearth, brushing dust from his hands. "Ain't no bother having another soul to cook for." He crossed to a shelf and began gathering supplies. "How do beans and cornbread sound? Not fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." "Oh, that sounds wonderful." Her stomach cramped at the mere thought of a hot meal. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's crust of bread. "Make yourself comfortable then," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Won't take but a few minutes to get something together." Hetty perched carefully on the edge of the chair, worried it might protest under her weight. But it was sturdy, clearly built by someone who knew their craft. She watched as Theo moved around the small space with practiced ease, setting a pot of beans to warm on the cook stove and mixing cornbread batter in a wooden bowl. The domestic routine of it all brought tears to her eyes. How long had it been since she'd sat at a proper table, watching someone prepare a meal? The simple dignity of it made her throat tight. Soon, the cabin filled with the mouth-watering aroma of baking cornbread. Theo set 2 tin plates on the table, along with cups of steaming coffee. When he spooned out generous portions of beans and cut thick slices of golden cornbread, Hetty's hands trembled. "Go on now," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Eat while it's hot." Hunger won out over manners. Hetty ate quickly, trying to remember to take smaller bites, but the food was too good to resist. Each spoonful of beans, each morsel of buttered cornbread felt like heaven after so many months of near starvation. It wasn't until she'd nearly cleaned her plate that she realized Theo had been watching her with quiet approval. "Sorry," she mumbled, heat rising in her cheeks. "I shouldn't. It ain't ladylike to eat so eager." "Nonsense," Theo said firmly. "Ain't nothing wrong with enjoying a meal when you're hungry. Would you like some more?" Fresh tears spilled down Hetty's cheeks. She couldn't hold them back any longer. "Why are you being so kind to me?" The words burst out between sobs. "Everyone else sees me as nothing but a burden. Too big, too much, taking up too much space in the world. That's what they've told me my whole life." She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. "My own husband said I was worthless before he drank away my dowry and left me with nothing. Said no man would ever want such a large woman taking up his bed and eating his food." The cabin fell quiet, except for the pop and crackle of the fire. When Theo finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "My Rebecca was built like you," he said softly. "Strong and curvy, beautiful as a summer morning. But folks in town, they mocked her something fierce, called her horrible names, made her feel ashamed of who she was." Hetty lowered her hands, looking at him through tear-blurred eyes. Theo stared into the flames, lost in memory. "She took sick 3 winters ago. Nothing to do with her size, mind you, just a fever that wouldn't break. But even then, even as she was dying, some of those town women had the nerve to say it was probably for the best." His jaw clenched. "Said I'd be free to find myself a proper-sized wife." He turned back to Hetty, and she saw the pain and determination in his eyes. That's when I made my vow. Never again would I stand by and watch a woman suffer for the sake of other folks' cruel notions about dignity. Never again would I let someone go hungry or cold just because they didn't fit some narrow idea of what's proper. Hetty's heart ached for the loss she heard in his voice, for the love that still lived in his memory of Rebecca. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Theo nodded, then rose from the table. He crossed to a chest near the bed and pulled out several thick blankets and a bedroll. "It's getting late," he said, laying them out near the hearth. "You can sleep here by the fire. It's the warmest spot in the cabin." He arranged the bedding with care, making sure the blankets would keep out any draft from the floor. "Stay as long as you wish," he said. "No obligation, no debt to repay, just a safe place to rest and heal." Outside, the wind howled through the pines, rattling the cabin's windows. But inside, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and an unexpected kindness, Hetty felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Theo just nodded and went to bank the fire for the night. Hetty settled onto the bedroll, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The warmth of the hearth seeped into her bones, and the soft crackle of the flames created a gentle lullaby. For the first time in months, she didn't have to worry about where she would sleep, or whether she would wake to cruel words and colder stares. Her belly was full, her body was warm, and she was safe. As she drifted off to sleep, Hetty sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the mountain man with the gentle heart who had seen her worth when everyone else had turned away. The wind continued its lonely song outside, but inside Theo's cabin, peace had finally found a home. Dawn crept through the frost-laced windows of Theo's cabin, painting golden stripes across the rough-hewn floorboards. Hetty stirred from her bedroll by the dying embers, the familiar ache in her joints reminding her of countless cold nights spent huddled in barns and abandoned shacks. But this morning was different. This morning, she woke to warmth and safety. She glanced toward Theo's bed, where he still slept soundly, his chest rising and falling beneath the patchwork quilt. Moving quietly, she stood and straightened her dress, then spotted a birch broom leaning in the corner. Her fingers itched to be useful. The broom's bristles whispered against the floor as Hetty worked, sweeping away dust and pine needles tracked in from yesterday's journey. The familiar motion soothed her, bringing back memories of happier times when she'd kept her own little house clean and welcoming. Theo's eyes opened at the sound. He watched silently as Hetty worked, her movements efficient and graceful despite her size. When she finished with the sweeping, she turned to find him sitting up in bed. "Hope I didn't wake you," she said, color rising in her cheeks. "Just wanted to earn my keep." "You don't need to earn anything," Theo replied, but his eyes crinkled with appreciation at the tidy floor. "Though I reckon that's the cleanest this cabin's been since Rebecca passed." Hetty set the broom aside and squared her shoulders. "Well, if you've got flour and lard, I could make us some proper biscuits for breakfast. Been too long since you had a woman's cooking, I expect." Theo pointed to the cabinet near the cook stove. "Everything you need should be in there. Help yourself." Soon, the cabin filled with the smell of baking bread. Hetty worked with practiced hands, cutting the biscuits and laying them in the cast-iron skillet, just as her mama had taught her. When she pulled them from the oven, golden brown and steaming, Theo's eyebrows rose in appreciation. "Those look better than any biscuits I've seen in an age," he said, reaching for one. They shared a simple breakfast of biscuits and coffee, comfortable silence broken only by the occasional appreciative murmur from Theo. When the last crumb was gone, he pushed back from the table. "Need to head into town for supplies," he said. "You're welcome to stay here if you'd rather not face those gossips again." Hetty straightened her spine. No, I'll come along. Can't hide forever, and we'll need more flour if you want biscuits tomorrow. A hint of a smile touched Theo's lips as he nodded. Together they bundled up against the cold and went out to hitch the team. The horses stomped impatiently in the fresh snow while Theo checked their harness. Hetty watched him work, admiring the sure way he handled the animals. The ride into Pine Bluff took nearly an hour, the sleigh runners cutting smooth tracks through the snow. As they approached the town, Hetty's stomach tightened at the sight of people going about their Sunday morning business. Heads turned as Theo guided the team down the main street, and whispers followed in their wake. "Look there, the beggar woman and her mountain man." Shameless, that's what it is. Poor Theo Boone, taking in strays like that. Hetty held her head high, though each whispered barb stung like a slap. Theo's jaw clenched, but he said nothing as he helped her down from the sleigh in front of the mercantile. The store bell jingled as they entered. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper who'd run Hetty off just yesterday, now forced a tight smile and nodded to Theo. "What can I get for you today, Mr. Boone?" "Need seed for spring planting," Theo said, "and flour, lamp oil, coffee." He moved through the store, selecting items while Hetty trailed, behind. Movement caught her eye. Several children pressed their faces against the store window, leaving smudgy handprints on the glass. Their clothes were patched and worn, marking them as likely belonging to the miners' families who lived in shacks on the edge of town. Hetty knew that look of hungry hope all too well. "Might we get some penny candy?" she asked softly, touching Theo's sleeve. "For the little ones outside?" Theo glanced at the window, then reached for the glass jar of striped candies without hesitation. "Add these to the bill," he told Peterson, who looked like he'd bitten into something sour. Outside, Hetty pressed candies into small, dirty palms, while their mothers watched suspiciously from across the street. One tiny girl threw her arms around Hetty's legs in thanks before scampering away, and Hetty had to blink back tears. They were loading the last of their supplies when a ranch hand rode up, his horse lathered despite the cold. "Mr. Boone! Thought folks ought to know. Railroad survey crew's been through. They're staking claims all along Cedar Creek, right up to where it passes your property." Theo's hands stilled on the wagon ties. "That so?" His voice was quiet, but Hetty heard the tension in it. "When did this happen?" "Just yesterday. They're talking about damming it up for the steam engines." The ranch hand shifted in his saddle. "Might want to check your water rights at the county office." "Much obliged for the warning." Theo finished securing the load, then helped Hetty back into the sleigh. Instead of heading home, he turned the team toward the courthouse at the end of the street. But the heavy wooden doors were locked tight, a sign declaring "Closed for Sunday services," hanging crooked on a nail. Theo stood looking at it for a long moment, his breath frosting in the air. "We'll come back tomorrow," Hetty said gently. "First thing." He nodded, but worry had carved deep lines around his mouth. As they started the long ride home, snow began falling in thick, wet flakes that clung to the horses' manes and blanketed the countryside in white. Hetty watched Theo's strong hands on the reins, saw the way his shoulders carried new tension. That creek was his lifeblood. Without it, his cabin and the garden plot he'd cleared would be worthless. She knew all too well how quickly a person could lose everything they'd worked for. Dusk was settling over the mountains by the time they reached the cabin, the snow falling heavier now. Tomorrow, they would face whatever the railroad company had planned. But tonight, they had warm shelter, full bellies, and each other's company. For Hetty, after so many months of desperate loneliness, that felt like riches beyond measure. Monday morning dawned clear and cold, frost etching delicate patterns on the cabin's small window panes. Hetty woke early again, this time to find Theo already up and dressed, stoking the cook stove fire with grim determination. "Made coffee." "Aye," said, nodding toward a steaming cup on the table. "Need to get an early start if we're to sort out this water rights business." Hetty wrapped her shawl tighter and settled at the table, warming her hands around the tin cup. "The Lord will guide us," she said softly. "He never gives us more than we can bear." Theo's only response was a grunt as he pulled on his heavy coat. Within the hour, they were back in the sleigh, heading down the mountain toward Pine Bluff. The morning sun caught the fresh snow in brilliant sparkles, but neither of them paid much attention to the beauty. Theo's jaw was set in a hard line, his thoughts clearly fixed on what awaited them at the county clerk's office. The courthouse stood tall and austere at the end of Pine Bluff's main street, its red brick walls a stark contrast to the white-wrapped world around it. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from his desk as they entered. "Mr. Boone," he said, nodding. His eyes slid past Hetty as if she weren't there. "What brings you down from your mountain?" "Heard tell of some railroad survey crew staking claims on Cedar Creek," Theo said, his voice carefully controlled. "Need to check the water rights filings." The clerk shuffled through a stack of papers, finally pulling out a thick document. "Ah, yes. Pacific and Western Railroad filed their claim 3 days ago. They're planning to dam the creek for their steam engines." He adjusted his spectacles. "All quite legal and proper." "Legal?" Theo's hand came down hard on the desk, making the clerk jump. "I never signed away my water rights. That creek's been part of my property since I homesteaded it 15 years ago." "Well now," the clerk said, spreading his hands, "the railroad has certain privileges granted by territorial law, for the greater good of progress, you understand." "Progress?" Theo spat the word like it tasted bitter. "You mean profit. They can't just take a man's water without so much as a by your leave." Hetty touched Theo's arm gently. "Perhaps we should pray on it," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "The law can be swayed by men's greed, but the Lord's justice stands firm." Some of the tension eased from Theo's shoulders at her words. He drew a deep breath, then fixed the clerk with a steady gaze. "I'll be looking into this further. Make sure you keep those papers safe." Outside, the morning had warmed enough to start melting the snow from the courthouse steps. Theo helped Hetty down carefully, mindful of the slick spots. "Got some other business to tend to," he said. "But there's a church service this evening. Would you care to attend?" Hetty's face brightened. "Oh yes, I would love that. It's been so long since I've been welcome in a proper church." They spent the afternoon gathering supplies and making discreet inquiries about the railroad's plans. As evening approached, they made their way to the small white church on the edge of town. The building was plain but well-tended, with warm lamplight spilling from its windows into the gathering dusk. Inside, the rough-hewn pews were already filling with townspeople. Hetty felt their stares as Theo led her to a seat near the back, but she kept her eyes forward, focused on the simple wooden cross hanging above the altar. The preacher, a silver-haired man with kind eyes, began the service with a prayer. Then he opened his Bible and began to speak about Ruth and Boaz, how Ruth, widowed and alone, found protection and love through Boaz's kindness, how God worked through their story to bring about his greater purpose. Hetty felt tears welling in her eyes as the preacher spoke. The parallels to her own situation were impossible to miss. When the congregation stood to sing hymns, she joined in without thinking, her clear voice rising pure and strong above the others. The familiar words of amazing grace filled the small church, and for a moment she forgot to be self-conscious about her size or the townspeople's judgment. Theo turned his head slightly, watching her as she sang. Something softened in his expression, though Hetty was too lost in the music to notice. After the service, while other congregants filed out, Theo guided Hetty forward to where the preacher stood by the altar. "Reverend Walsh," he said, his deep voice carrying in the now quiet church. "I'd like you to meet Miss Hetty May. She's staying at my cabin for a time, and she's under my protection." The preacher's smile was genuine as he took Hetty's hand. "Welcome, Miss May. Your voice is a blessing to our little congregation. I hope we'll be seeing more of you." Behind them, whispers rustled like dry leaves. "Shameless woman," someone muttered, "living alone with a man, and him not even kin." But not everyone's reactions were unkind. Mrs. Ruth Carver, the town's respected midwife, stepped forward to squeeze Hetty's hand. "That was amazing grace, like I haven't heard it sung in years, dear," she said warmly. Several other widows followed her lead, offering quiet words of welcome. The stars were bright in the clear mountain sky as Theo helped Hetty into the sleigh for the ride home. They had traveled perhaps a mile in comfortable silence before Hetty gathered her courage to speak. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. "Introduce me to the preacher like that? Declare your protection in front of everyone? You're risking your reputation, standing up for someone like me." Theo was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Because I see more in you than they ever will." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if stating something obvious. "You've got strength they can't recognize and kindness they don't deserve. Everything else is just talk." Hetty turned her face away, blinking back tears. The sleigh runners whispered over the snow, and overhead, the stars continued their steady march across the heavens. Whatever tomorrow might bring with the railroad dispute, for now, she felt truly seen for the first time in years. The horses' breath fogged in the cold air as they continued up the mountain trail, their way lit by starlight and the thin sliver of a waning moon. Neither Theo nor Hetty spoke again, but the silence between them was full of unspoken understanding. The week settled into a gentle rhythm at Theo's cabin, each day bringing new tasks and quiet discoveries. Monday morning found Hetty examining Theo's worn buckskins, her practiced eye noting the frayed seams and missing buttons. She'd brought little with her, but her tin of needles and thread had been too precious to leave behind. "These need mending," she said, holding up a jacket with a torn sleeve. "May I?" Theo looked up from cleaning his rifle, surprise crossing his weathered face. "Ain't had anyone tend to my clothes since—" He trailed off, then nodded. "Much obliged." Hetty worked by the window, where winter sunlight streamed through the glass. Her needle flashed steadily, drawing the tough leather together with neat stitches. The familiar work soothed her, giving purpose to hands that had been idle too long. "You've got a fine touch with that needle," Theo observed, watching her work. His voice carried warmth that made her cheeks flush. "Mama taught me," Hetty replied softly. "Said a woman's strength shows in the smallest details." Tuesday brought a break in the clouds, and Theo decided it was time Hetty learned to split kindling. Outside, the snow crunched under their boots as he showed her how to place the logs, how to swing the axe with precision rather than force. "Like this?" Hetty asked, bringing the axe down. The wood split cleanly, falling to either side. "Natural as breathing," Theo approved. "You're a quick study." Her arms ached by midday, but pride bloomed in her chest at the neat pile of kindling she'd produced. It felt good to contribute, to be more than just a burden. On Wednesday afternoon, Theo set up tin cans on a snow-covered stump 50 yards from the cabin. He brought out his spare rifle, a lighter one than his hunting piece. "Every woman should know how to shoot," he declared, showing her how to hold the weapon. "Especially out here in the mountains." Hetty's hands trembled as she lifted the rifle. Her late husband had never allowed her near firearms, claiming women were too addled to handle them safely. "Steady now," Theo murmured, adjusting her grip. "Breathe slow and squeeze gentle. Don't pull." The rifle cracked, and a tin can flew off the stump. Hetty lowered the weapon, eyes wide. "I did it!" "Sure did," Theo grinned. "Got a natural eye, just like with that axe." They practiced until the light began to fade, Hetty's confidence growing with each shot. By the time they headed inside, she'd hit more targets than she'd missed. Thursday and Friday passed in similar fashion, Hetty tending to domestic tasks while Theo worked outside, then more shooting, practice in the afternoons. She found herself humming as she worked, old hymns rising naturally to her lips. When Saturday evening arrived, Hetty decided to prepare something special. While Theo was out checking his trap lines, she took stock of their supplies. In the cold storage, she found venison that Theo had brought home earlier in the week. Her heart quickened. It had been so long since she'd cooked proper meat. The cabin filled with rich aromas as she worked, adding wild onions and roots from Theo's stored vegetables. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, he stopped in the doorway, breathing deep. "Something smells mighty fine," he said, hanging up his coat. Hetty ladled the thick stew into bowls, setting them on the table with the last of yesterday's cornbread. I haven't cooked meat in months," she admitted, watching anxiously as he took his first bite. Theo closed his eyes, savoring the taste. "Tastes like home," he said simply. "Real home, the kind a man dreams about." Hetty blinked back tears, focusing on her own bowl. Such simple praise, yet it filled an empty place inside her she hadn't known was there. As the evening deepened, they settled into what had become their routine. Theo sat in his chair by the fire, whittling what looked to be a small animal from a piece of pine. Hetty took her place on the bench near the hearth, and almost without thinking, began to sing. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Her voice filled the cabin, clear and true. The familiar hymn gave way to others. "Sweet hour of prayer, rock of ages, be thou my vision." Theo's knife moved steadily, but she caught him watching her sometimes, his expression thoughtful. The snow continued to deepen outside, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, the lamp cast warm shadows on the log walls, and the fire crackled softly beneath her songs. As the evening drew to a close, Theo cleared his throat. "Church social tomorrow," he said, setting aside his whittling. "Folks bring food, share news, sing some. Thought we might go." Hetty's hands twisted in her skirt. "Oh, I don't know, Theo. The way people talk." "Let them talk," he said firmly. "You've got as much right to be there as anyone, more than some, with that voice the good Lord gave you." He leaned forward, fixing her with his steady gaze. "Ain't right for anyone to hide from God's people, Hetty, not even when his people forget their Christian charity." "But," she gestured helplessly at herself, at the body that had brought her so much scorn. "But nothing," Theo said. "You're coming. We'll bring that fine stew of yours. Let them taste what they've been missing." His tone softened. "Besides, I reckon the Lord likes your singing better than their gossip." Hetty felt tears threatening again. They seemed always near the surface these days, but not from sadness. This man's simple acceptance, his matter-of-fact defense of her worth, kept catching her off guard. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me. Really seeing me, I mean. Not just—" She gestured at herself again. Theo was quiet for a long moment. "My Ellen," he finally said, She was built like you. Strong, capable woman who could cook like an angel and shoot straight as any man, but people's cruel words wore her down, made her feel worthless. His voice roughened. Won't stand by and watch that happen again. Not ever. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, an owl called softly in the darkness. Hetty thought about the next day, about facing the townspeople who had mocked her so recently. But sitting here in the warm cabin, with Theo's quiet strength beside her, their scorn seemed less important somehow. "All right," she said. "We'll go, and I'll make another pot of stew to bring." Theo nodded, satisfied, and picked up his whittling again. Hetty began to sing once more, her voice carrying all the hope and gratitude she couldn't put into words. The small cabin held them like a cupped hand, secure against the winter night, as the week drew to its gentle close. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the winter sun casting long shadows across the pristine snow. Hetty stood before the small mirror in Theo's cabin, adjusting her freshly pressed dress. She'd spent the morning scouring and mending it, determined to present herself as best she could. The familiar weight of judgment already pressed on her shoulders, though they hadn't even left for town yet. "Ready?" Theo's voice carried from outside, where he was preparing the sleigh. "Just a moment," Hetty called back, smoothing her hair one last time. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and picked up the covered pot of venison stew she'd prepared. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. Theo had the sleigh ready, runners gleaming against the snow. He'd put on his good coat, and his beard was neatly trimmed. Something warmed in Hetty's chest at the sight of him making an effort for her sake. He helped her up onto the seat, careful of the pot she carried, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Mighty fine day for a social," he said, clicking to the horses. The sleigh bells jingled cheerfully as they set off down the mountain trail. Hetty's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "What if they—" "None of that now," Theo interrupted gently. "You've got as much right to be there as anyone. More than some, I reckon." The ride into Pine Bluff passed too quickly. Soon they could hear fiddle music drifting from the church hall, a lively tune that made the horses' ears prick forward. Wagons and sleighs were already lined up outside, and people in their Sunday best hurried in from the cold. Theo helped Hetty down, taking the heavy pot from her hands. "Walk proud," he murmured, offering his arm. "You're with me." The warmth and noise of the social hit them as they entered. Couples whirled across the wooden floor to the fiddle's rhythm, while children darted between the adults. Long tables lined the walls, laden with pies and other offerings. The familiar scents of coffee and cinnamon filled the air. Conversations faltered as heads turned their way. Whispers followed their progress across the room. Hetty felt her cheeks burning, but Theo's arm remained steady under her hand. "Afternoon, folks," he said clearly, nodding to various neighbors. His voice carried no shame or hesitation. "This here's Miss Hetty May. She's been keeping house for me these past weeks." Some turned away, pretending not to hear. Others stared openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly hidden disdain. Hetty's grip tightened on Theo's arm. "Why, welcome, dear." The warm voice belonged to Mrs. Ruth Carver, the town's elderly midwife. The silver-haired woman moved forward, her round face creased in a genuine smile. "I've been hoping someone would bring some real food to offset all these sweets." She embraced Hetty warmly, as naturally as if they'd known each other for years. "We've all needed mercy at one time or another," she said, loud enough for nearby listeners to hear. "The Lord knows I surely have." Tears pricked at Hetty's eyes at the simple kindness. Mrs. Carver helped her set up her pot of stew on one of the tables, chattering all the while about her own struggles as a widow years ago. The fiddle struck up a new tune, and Theo turned to Hetty. "May I have this dance?" Her heart jumped. "Oh, I don't know if—" "Course you can," Mrs. Carver interrupted. "Go on now, both of you." Theo led her onto the floor, his hand warm at her waist. Some couples moved away, but others stayed, though Hetty could feel their stares. She kept her eyes on Theo's chest, trying to follow his lead. "Head up," he murmured. "You're doing fine." Gradually, Hetty relaxed into the simple steps. Theo was a capable dancer, guiding her surely through the turns. She even caught herself smiling once or twice, especially when Mrs. Carver gave her an encouraging wink as they passed. After the dance, more people approached, perhaps encouraged by Mrs. Carver's example. Most were other widows or older folks who knew what it was to struggle. They praised her stew and asked about life up at Theo's cabin. Though some still whispered behind their hands, Hetty felt the first flutter of acceptance in her heart. As the afternoon wore on, the preacher called for hymns. Without thinking, Hetty joined in when Amazing Grace began. Her clear voice rose above the general singing, carrying the familiar words with all the emotion of recent weeks. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. A hush fell over the room as people turned to listen. Hetty nearly faltered, but Theo's steady presence beside her gave her courage to continue. Mrs. Carver's voice joined hers on the second verse. Then others followed. By the final verse, even some who had snickered earlier were singing along. When the hymn ended, there was a moment of profound silence before conversation resumed. But something had shifted. The mockery that had followed them earlier seemed muted now, replaced by thoughtful glances and tentative nods of greeting. As the winter sun began to set, folks started gathering their things to head home. Mrs. Carver hugged Hetty again, extracting a promise to visit soon. Others offered polite goodbyes, a few even asking if she'd bring her stew to the next social. The stars were just beginning to appear as Theo helped Hetty into the sleigh for the journey home. The horse's breath steamed in the cooling air as they headed up the mountain trail, bells chiming softly in the gathering dusk. "Thank you," Hetty said quietly, "for making me come today. For everything." Theo was silent for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the starlight. "Haven't felt such peace since Ellen passed," he finally said. "Having you there today, hearing you sing, felt right somehow." Hetty's heart swelled with emotions she wasn't ready to name. She watched the stars emerge one by one above the snow-covered pines, feeling more at home than she had in years. The sleigh carried them up the mountain through the quiet night, toward the warm light of their cabin. 2 days after the social, winter sunshine streamed through the cabin windows as Hetty kneaded bread dough at the pine table. The familiar work soothed her spirits, still buoyed by memories of Sunday's gathering. Theo sat nearby in his wooden chair, mending a pair of leather work gloves. The sudden thunder of hoofbeats broke their peaceful morning routine. Theo rose quickly, hand moving toward his rifle before recognizing young Tommy Wheeler from town, spurring his horse into the yard. "Mr. Boone," Tommy called out, his voice carrying clear through the cabin walls. "Got urgent business from Pine Bluff." Hetty wiped her hands on her apron as Theo strode to the door. Cold air rushed in with Tommy's entrance, his cheeks red from the hard ride up the mountain trail. "Railroad foreman sent this," Tommy said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Says it's about your water rights, sir." Theo's expression darkened as he unfolded the document. Hetty moved closer, watching his face grow thunderous as he read. His hands began to shake. "What is it?" she asked softly. "They're claiming I sold the water rights years ago." His voice was rough with disbelief. "Got a deed here with my name on it." Tommy shifted nervously by the door. Foreman said to tell you they're starting work on the creek next week. Said it's all legal and proper. Theo thrust the paper toward Hetty. Look at this. Says I signed away my rights to Cedar Creek back in '68. Never signed no such thing. Hetty studied the document carefully. The official stamps and seals looked genuine enough, but something about the signature caught her eye. She'd spent years watching her late husband scrawl his drunken name across IOUs and deeds. This signature had that same uncertain quality. The writing's shaky, she observed, like someone trying too hard to make it look natural. Exactly. Theo slammed his fist against the table, making Tommy jump. It's forged, plain as day. But who would... Hetty's stomach clenched as a terrible memory surfaced. Her husband, Thomas, stumbling home one night, reeking of whiskey and bragging about drinking with some railroad men. He'd mentioned water rights, something about easy money to be made. She'd been too beaten down then to pay much attention. Guilt churned inside her. Could Thomas have been involved in this somehow? Had his drinking and scheming with land agents somehow led to this forged deed? The thought made her feel sick. You all right, Miss Hetty? Tommy asked. You've gone awful pale. She forced a weak smile. Just worried is all. Theo was pacing now, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Got to fight this, he muttered. Can't let them steal my water rights with false papers. County court's your best bet, Tommy offered. My pa says Judge Wilson's fair-minded when it comes to railroad disputes. Hetty watched Theo stride to the window, his broad shoulders tense as he stared out at the snow-covered creek. That water source was vital to his survival up here. Without it, his small cattle herd wouldn't make it through summer. Tommy, Theo said finally, ride back and tell that foreman I'll see him in court before I let him touch my creek. The boy nodded eagerly. Yes, sir, Mr. Boone. Pa says he'll stand with you if you need witnesses. Lots of folks remember when you first claimed this land. After Tommy galloped away, silence fell heavy in the cabin. Hetty returned to her bread dough, but her movements were mechanical now, her mind churning with secret worry. She should tell Theo about Thomas's connection to the railroad men. But shame held her tongue. What if it somehow made things worse? Theo dropped heavily into his chair, the forged deed crumpled in his fist. 20 years I've worked this land, he said quietly. Built every fence, dug every post hole. Now some railroad man with a false paper thinks he can take it? Hetty wiped flour from her hands and moved to stand beside him. We'll prove it's forged, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The truth will come out. He looked up at her, his eyes troubled. We. Of course. She squeezed his shoulder gently. You took me in when no one else would. Let me help you fight this. Something softened in his expression. Much obliged, Hetty. Truth is, I've grown used to having you here. Nice not facing troubles alone anymore. Her heart warmed at his words, even as guilt gnawed deeper. She busied herself with the bread dough while Theo wrote a letter to the county court requesting a hearing. The afternoon light grew long and shadows crept across the cabin floor. That evening, after Theo went to check on his horses, Hetty sat alone by the fire. The forged deed lay on the table, its official seals seeming to mock her. She thought of Thomas, wondering if his drunken dealings had somehow led to this moment. The shame of it pressed down like a physical weight. When Theo returned, stamping snow from his boots, she had pushed the thoughts deep inside. But they lingered there, heavy as storm clouds, while he spoke of gathering witnesses and preparing for court. Railroad's got money and lawyers, he said, stoking the fire. But we've got truth on our side. That's got to count for something. Hetty nodded, forcing a smile she didn't feel. The Lord sees what's right, she said softly. We must trust in that. As darkness settled over the mountain, Theo studied maps and land records by lamplight. Hetty's hand stayed busy with mending, but her mind wandered dark paths. She should tell him about Thomas, should confess her fears about her husband's possible role in this trouble. Instead, she watched Theo's determined face in the lamplight and kept her silence. His faith in her friendship felt too precious to risk. Yet even as she made this choice, she knew the truth would have to come out eventually. She only prayed it wouldn't destroy the trust growing between them. Later, lying in her bedroll near the hearth, Hetty listened to the wind keening outside. Theo's steady breathing came from his corner of the cabin, but sleep eluded her. Tomorrow they would begin preparing their case for court. The thought of standing against the railroad's power terrified her. But the alternative, watching Theo lose his land and livelihood to a forged deed, was worse. Whatever her own guilt in this matter, she would help him fight. She had to believe that justice would prevail, that truth would overcome deceit. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her into uneasy dreams of Thomas drinking with strange men, of signatures flowing like water across paper, of trust crumbling like sand. Through it all, Theo's voice echoed with his vow to fight, a promise that both comforted and condemned her troubled heart. Morning dawned cold and clear over the Colorado highlands. Frost etched delicate patterns on the cabin windows as Theo and Hetty prepared for their journey into Pine Bluff. Hetty wrapped herself in her thickest shawl, while Theo hitched the horses to his sleigh, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "Storm's coming," Theo observed, glancing at the steel-gray sky. "Best make this quick." The sleigh runners cut clean tracks through fresh snow as they descended the mountain trail. Hetty sat close to Theo for warmth, her thoughts churning like the clouds gathering above. Every mile closer to town seemed to increase the weight of her secrets. Pine Bluff's main street was quiet when they arrived, most folks staying indoors against the cold. Theo tied the horses outside the weather-worn building that served as both law office and land registry. A brass plate beside the door read, "Jonathan Wheeler, Attorney at Law." Inside, coal smoke from a potbelly stove competed with the musty smell of old papers. Mr. Wheeler, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his desk as they entered. "Mr. Boone," he said, setting aside his pen. "What brings you down from your mountain?" Theo explained about the railroad's claim, while Hetty stood quietly by the window, watching snowflakes begin to fall. Wheeler listened, occasionally nodding as he examined the forged deed. "Nasty business," the lawyer said finally. "Railroad's got deep pockets and sharp lawyers in Denver. Fighting them won't be easy." "Don't care about easy," Theo replied. "Care about right." Wheeler removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "You'll need proof of continuous land use. Witnesses who can testify you've been working that creek since before '68. Bills of sale for your cattle. Water rights documentation." "Got most of that?" Theo said. "Been keeping records since I first homesteaded." "Good. Gather everything. We'll need statements from neighbors, too. Anyone who can verify your claim." Wheeler replaced his glasses. "But I warn you, the railroad plays rough. They've broken better men than you with delays and legal fees." Hetty's hands tightened on her shawl. She knew too well how powerful companies could crush ordinary folks. Hadn't she watched Thomas throw away everything they owned to land agents with smooth words and sharp papers? The meeting ended quickly after that. Wheeler promised to review their case, but made no promises. Outside, the snow was falling harder, thick flakes swirling in the wind. They rode home in troubled silence. Theo's jaw was set, his expression dark as storm clouds. Hetty wished she could ease his burden somehow, The knowledge of her own connection to this mess pressed against her heart like a stone. Dusk was settling when they reached the cabin. While Theo tended the horses, Hetty busied herself at the cook stove. She had spotted some wrinkled apples in the root cellar that morning. Not much, but enough to make something sweet. The cabin slowly filled with the warm smell of frying apples and cinnamon as Hetty worked. She had learned early in her marriage that good food could sometimes lift the heaviest spirits. The memory brought a fresh wave of guilt. Theo came in stamping snow from his boots. He hung his coat by the door, then stood watching her cook. "Smells good," he said softly. "Thought we could use something sweet tonight?" Hetty stirred the apples, gathering her courage. "Theo, there's something I need to tell you." He pulled out a chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "What's troubling you?" Hetty's hands trembled as she moved the skillet from the heat. "It's about the railroad. And Thomas. Your late husband?" She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Before he died, Thomas. He signed away my dowry land to the same railroad company that's claiming your creek." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. When she finally looked up, Theo's face was absolutely still. "He'd been drinking with some land agents," she continued, the words spilling out now. "Said they promised him good money, but they cheated him, like they cheated everyone. We lost everything. The farm, the cattle, even my mother's silver spoons." Her voice broke. "I should have told you sooner. When I saw that forged deed yesterday, I recognized. It reminded me." "Hetty." Theo's voice was gentle. "Look at me." She forced herself to meet his gaze, expecting anger or disappointment. Instead, she found only kindness in his weathered face. "Your past isn't your fault," he said quietly. "What your husband did, that's not on you." The simple acceptance in his words brought tears to her eyes. She turned quickly back to the stove, spooning the fried apples into bowls. They ate supper mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet. After the dishes were done, Theo settled in his chair by the fire with some papers to review. The warmth and the long day soon had his head nodding. Hetty watched him doze, feeling both grateful for his understanding and troubled by the secrets she still kept. When she was certain he was asleep, she crept to her bedroll and pulled out her old hymn book. The worn leather cover was soft beneath her fingers as she opened it carefully. Here she had tucked away the few precious papers she'd salvaged from her marriage: her parents' wedding certificate, a letter from her mother, the deed to her dowry land. And somewhere, she remembered, there had been a letter from Thomas mentioning the railroad men. Pages rustled softly as she searched. If there was anything here that might help prove the railroad's dishonest dealings, she had to find it. She owed Theo that much, at least. Outside, snow continued to fall in the darkness. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Theo's steady breathing mingled with the whisper of paper as Hetty carefully turned another page, searching for answers in the fragments of her past. Dawn brought fresh snow and bitter winds to the mountain. Hetty woke early, stoking the dying embers in the hearth until flames licked at new logs. The cabin slowly filled with warmth as she moved about her morning tasks, trying to keep her troubled thoughts at bay. Theo had already dressed and eaten a hasty breakfast of cold biscuits. He pulled on his heavy coat while explaining his plans for the day. "Got to ride out to the Johnson place," he said, adjusting his collar against the cold. "Then over to see old Mike Watson and the Hendersons. Need their statements about the creek rights." Hetty nodded, wringing her hands in her apron. "How far is that?" "Few hours' ride between them all." Theo checked his rifle before slinging it across his back. Should be back by sunset, weather permitting." She followed him to the door, watching as he saddled his horse. The animal's breath came in great white plumes in the frigid morning air. "Be careful," she called as he mounted. Theo touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before turning his horse toward the trail. Hetty stood in the doorway until horse and rider disappeared into the trees. Then she returned to the warmth of the cabin, determined to keep busy. She built up the fire again and put on a pot of beans to simmer for supper. Near the woodbox, she spotted Theo's spare coat with its torn sleeve. Perfect, something useful to occupy her hands. She retrieved her sewing basket and settled into the chair by the window, where weak winter light helped guide her stitches. As she worked, she hummed old hymns to keep herself company. The familiar melodies brought comfort, yet couldn't entirely quiet the guilty thoughts that had plagued her since yesterday's revelation about the railroad. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she sang softly, her needle moving in rhythm. But even the beloved words felt hollow today. What grace could there be in bringing trouble to the one person who had shown her true kindness? By early afternoon, the patch was nearly complete, but Hetty's restlessness had only grown. She paced the cabin's length, pausing at windows to stare at the gathering clouds. Snow had begun falling again, fat flakes swirling in the strengthening wind. The beans bubbled on the stove, filling the cabin with their rich aroma. Yet Hetty found she had no appetite. Her stomach churned with anxiety as she thought about the railroad's false claims on Theo's land. How many other honest folks had they cheated, just as they'd helped Thomas steal away her dowry farm? The afternoon deepened toward dusk, but Theo hadn't returned. Wind rattled the cabin's windows as the storm intensified. Hetty tried to tell herself he had simply taken shelter with one of the neighbors, but darker fears crept in. What if something had happened to him out there? What if this was God's punishment for her deception? She sank into Theo's chair, burying her face in her hands. "Lord, help me," she whispered. "I'm nothing but trouble to this good man." The cabin's walls seemed to close in around her as memories surfaced. Thomas drinking away their future, land agents with their smooth lies, the shame of becoming a beggar. Now here she was, bringing the same corruption to Theo's doorstep. "He deserves better," she murmured to the empty room. Moving as if in a dream, Hetty found paper and pencil in Theo's desk drawer. Her hands shook as she wrote, "Dear Theo, you saved my life with your kindness, and I can never repay that debt. But I won't let my cursed past destroy your home too. The railroad men who ruined me can't be allowed to take what's yours. You'll fight better without my burden weighing you down. God bless and keep you always." She placed the note in the center of the pine table, where he couldn't miss it. Then she gathered her few belongings: the hymnal, her mother's handkerchief, the patched shawl. The cabin door creaked as she pulled it open, letting in a blast of snow-laden wind. Hetty paused on the threshold, looking back at the warm space that had briefly felt like home. The fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and the beans still simmered on the stove. Everything spoke of comfort, of belonging. Her heart ached to stay. But she couldn't. She wouldn't bring ruin to another good man's door. Squaring her shoulders, Hetty stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet as she pushed the door closed behind her. Snow stung her face and worked its way into her clothes despite the shawl wrapped tight around her. She knew the trail to town lay southeast, following the creek's course down the mountain. But in the swirling snow, every direction looked the same. Still, she had to try. One foot in front of the other, she began walking. The wind howled through the trees, drowning out all other sounds. Snow had already filled in Theo's horse's tracks from that morning. Hetty trudged onward, her feet growing numb despite her sturdy boots. The shawl offered little protection against the cutting wind. "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart," she recited through chattering teeth, trying to keep her courage up. But the words were swept away by the storm. The early winter dusk was rapidly fading to true darkness. Hetty could barely see 3 feet ahead through the curtain of falling snow. She had no idea how far she'd come, or if she was even still on the trail. Her legs ached with cold and fatigue. A branch cracked somewhere in the darkness, making her jump. Were there wolves in these mountains? Bears? The thought spurred her to move faster, though her numb feet stumbled on hidden obstacles. "Please, Lord," she prayed, "just let me reach town. Let me spare Theo from any more trouble." But with each step, the storm seemed to grow fiercer. The wind cut through her layers of clothing as if they were paper. She couldn't feel her hands or feet anymore, and exhaustion dragged at her limbs. Still, she pushed onward through deepening snow. She had to keep moving, had to protect Theo from the mess she'd brought to his door. Had to... Hetty's foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow. She pitched forward, landing face first in a drift. The cold shocked what little breath remained from her lungs. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled and gave way. "Help me," she whispered, though there was no one to hear. The snow was so soft, almost like a feather bed. Maybe if she just rested for a moment, just caught her breath. But even as her eyes grew heavy, a small voice in her mind whispered that to sleep now would mean never waking again. Was this to be her end, then? To die alone in a storm, just another burden lifted from the world? Hetty thought of Theo's kind eyes, of his quiet strength and unwavering faith in her worth. What would he think when he found her note? Would he blame himself? The thought brought tears that froze on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she murmured into the snow. "So sorry." The storm raged on around her as consciousness began to fade. The last thing Hetty heard was the wind in the pines, singing like a hymn of grace she no longer felt she deserved. Theo urged his tired horse homeward through the deepening night. The beast's hooves crunched against fresh-fallen snow as wind whipped between the pines. Something felt wrong. The cabin windows ahead showed no welcoming lamplight. No smoke curled from the chimney despite the bitter cold. His horse nickered nervously as they approached. No delicious cooking smells greeted them. No hymns drifted on the wind. The silence pressed against his ears like a physical weight. "Hetty?" he called, swinging down from the saddle. No answer came. The cabin door creaked open at his touch. Inside, darkness and cold struck him like a blow. The fire had burned down to sullen coals, and the pot of beans sat forgotten on the cold stove. His heart thundered against his ribs as he fumbled to light the lamp with shaking hands. Golden light spilled across the pine table, illuminating a folded paper. His blood turned to ice as he read Hetty's farewell note. The words blurred before his eyes. "Cursed past, burden. God bless and keep you." "No," he whispered hoarsely. "No, no, no." Without even taking time to warm himself by the dying fire, Theo grabbed his heaviest coat and the lamp. He checked his rifle was loaded. Wolves sometimes grew bold in storms. His horse protested with a tired whicker as he swung back into the saddle. "Sorry, old friend," he murmured, patting the beast's neck. "But we've got to find her." They plunged into the howling night. The lantern's glow made a small circle of visibility in the whirling snow. Theo squinted against the stinging flakes, searching for any sign of tracks. But the storm had already erased most marks from the trail. "Hetty," he shouted into the wind. His voice seemed pathetically small against nature's fury. "Hetty May!" The horse picked its way carefully down the mountain trail. Theo's legs ached with cold, and ice formed in his beard. Still he pressed on, swinging the lantern in wide arcs to catch any glimpse of movement. Hours passed. The storm showed no sign of letting up. Theo's hands had gone numb despite his thick gloves, and his throat was raw from calling. But the thought of Hetty alone in this killing weather drove him onward. "Lord," he prayed through chattering teeth, "guide me to her. Don't let me be too late." As if in answer, his horse suddenly snorted and halted. Its ears pricked forward, sensing something ahead. Theo raised the lantern higher, heart leaping as the light caught a dark shape half buried in the snow. "Hetty!" He practically fell from the saddle in his haste to reach her. She lay crumpled in a drift, her shawl dusted white with snow. Her lips had taken on a terrifying bluish tinge, and her skin felt like ice beneath his touch. But when he gathered her close, he felt the shallow rise and fall of breathing. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered fervently. Then louder, "Hetty, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. One hand still clutched her precious hymn book to her chest. "Theo?" she murmured, voice barely audible above the wind. "You shouldn't have come." "Hush now," he said, already shrugging out of his coat to wrap around her. "Save your strength." "No." Despite her weakness, she tried to push him away. "Leave me. I'm cursed. Everything I touch turns to ruin." Theo's heart broke at the despair in her voice. He gathered her more firmly in his arms, lifting her from the snow as if she weighed nothing. "Listen to me, Hetty May," he said fiercely. "You are my blessing, not my curse. God sent you to me, curvy and strong, for this very fight." She sobbed weakly against his chest. "But the railroad, my husband—" "None of that matters," Theo interrupted. He carried her toward his waiting horse, which stood patient despite the storm. "What matters is you're alive, and you're coming home." Getting them both mounted was an awkward struggle, but Theo managed it. He settled Hetty before him in the saddle, keeping her secure with one arm while the other held the reins. She shivered violently against him, her teeth chattering. "Hold fast," he murmured, turning the horse's head toward home. "Just hold fast to me." The journey back seemed to take forever. The storm raged around them, doing its best to drive them from the trail. But Theo's horse knew the way, and step by careful step they climbed back up the mountain. Hetty drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling fragments of hymns or apologies. Each time, Theo would squeeze her gently and remind her to stay with him. His own exhaustion meant nothing compared to the precious burden in his arms. At last, the cabin's bulk loomed out of the swirling snow. Theo's hands shook with cold as he dismounted, then lifted Hetty down. She stumbled, her legs too numb to hold her. Without hesitation, he scooped her up again and carried her inside. The fire had died completely, leaving the cabin bitter cold. Theo laid Hetty gently in his chair, then moved with urgent purpose. Soon flames leaped up from fresh kindling, and he'd hung a pot of water to heat. "We need to get you warm," he said, turning back to Hetty. She looked so small, huddled in his oversized coat. Her face was pale as milk except for patches of angry red where the wind had burned her cheeks. "Why?" she whispered. Her eyes were glassy with cold and exhaustion. "Why did you come after me?" Theo knelt before her, taking her frozen hands in his. "Because you matter, Hetty May. Because you're worth saving. And because I—" He swallowed hard. "Because I care what happens to you." Fresh tears spilled down her wind-chapped cheeks. "But I'll only bring you trouble. The railroad—" "We'll face them together," Theo said firmly. Your past doesn't define you, and it sure as shooting doesn't make you cursed. He rose to check the heating water, then began gathering blankets. Now, no more talk of leaving. This is your home for as long as you want it, understand? Hetty nodded weakly, clutching the recovered hymn book to her chest like a shield. I understand, she whispered. Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside the cabin, warmth began to return. As color slowly came back to Hetty's cheeks, Theo silently thanked God for leading him to her in time. Whatever battles lay ahead with the railroad, they would face them together. For now, that was enough. Morning sunlight filtered through frost-covered windows, casting weak shadows across the cabin floor. Hetty stirred beneath a mountain of quilts near the hearth, her body aching as consciousness slowly returned. The fire crackled softly, and she could smell something cooking. Rich beef broth, she realized, as her senses sharpened. Theo's quiet footsteps approached. You're awake, he said, relief evident in his deep voice. He knelt beside her makeshift bed, a steaming cup in his weathered hands. Think you can manage some broth? Hetty tried to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. The events of the previous night came rushing back, her desperate flight into the storm, the numbing cold, Theo finding her half buried in snow. Shame burned hot in her chest, warmer than the fire. I'm so sorry, she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. Her throat felt raw from the cold. I never meant to cause such trouble. Hush now. Theo helped her sit up, tucking another blanket around her shoulders. No more talk of trouble or blame. Here, drink this. It'll help warm you from the inside. The broth was rich and salty, warming her chest as she sipped carefully. Theo had seasoned it with herbs from his winter stores, and the familiar taste of sage reminded her of better days. She took another slow drink, gathering courage to speak again. You could have died coming after me in that storm, she said at last. I wouldn't have blamed you for staying safe by the fire. Theo's face grew serious. Listen close, Hetty May, because I mean every word of this. We're in this fight together now, against the railroad, against anyone who'd try to take what's rightfully ours. No more running off alone, you hear? His earnest tone brought fresh tears to her eyes. But my past is just that. Past, he interrupted firmly. Whatever your husband did, whatever schemes he was mixed up in, that's not your burden to carry alone anymore. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Hetty clutched the warm cup closer, letting its heat seep into her cold fingers. I don't deserve such kindness, she murmured. That's not for you to decide, Theo said simply. He rose to stir the pot hanging over the fire, then paused. Speaking of your past, where's your hymn book? It fell from your shawl when I carried you in last night. Hetty's heart jumped. My book, is it safe? The leather-bound volume held more than just hymns. It contained all her important papers, the only pieces of her former life she'd managed to save. Rest easy. Theo crossed to his chair and lifted something from the seat. Found it this morning when I was gathering kindling. Pages got a bit damp, but it should dry just fine. Relief flooded through her as he placed the familiar book in her hands. The worn leather was indeed damp, but the pages inside seemed mostly protected. She opened it carefully, mindful of the delicate papers tucked between its pages. There's something you should see, she said, fingers trembling slightly as she drew out several folded documents. I've kept all my important papers here, hidden away. Marriage certificate, property deeds, receipts. Theo sat beside her as she spread the papers on her lap. Most were ordinary documents. Her parents' will, church records, notes from her teaching days. but one yellowed page caught their attention. Hetty's hands shook as she unfolded it. This is the deed to my dowry property," she breathed. "The land my father left me when I married." Theo leaned closer, squinting at the faded writing. "What's that notation at the bottom?" Hetty's heart thundered as she read the legal script. It says the property was never legally transferred. My husband tried to sell it to the railroad, but he never had the right. It was still in my name." "Let me see that." Theo took the paper carefully, holding it up to the morning light. His eyes widened as he read. "Hetty, do you realize what this means? If your land was never properly sold, then any deals the railroad made using it as collateral would be invalid, including—" He looked up, excitement building in his voice, "including any water rights they claim to have bought from your husband." Hope bloomed in Hetty's chest, fragile but growing stronger. Could this help prove their deed to your creek is false? It's evidence of their dishonest dealings, at the very least. Theo was already on his feet, pacing with nervous energy. "We need to get this before the judge right away. Show him how they've been operating." Hetty watched him move about the cabin, gathering warm clothes and supplies. "Today? But the storm?" "Storm's passed." Theo pulled back the curtain, revealing bright winter sunshine sparkling on fresh snow. "Roads will be rough, but my team can handle it. That is," he paused, looking back at her with concern, "if you're strong enough for the journey?" Determination straightened Hetty's spine. "I'm strong enough," she said firmly. "This might be our only chance to stop them." Theo nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit I've come to expect from you." He helped her to her feet, supporting her until she found her balance. "Let me hitch the team while you get dressed. We'll wrap you up warm in the sleigh. No risks of catching cold after last night." While Theo went out to prepare the horses, Hetty changed into her warmest dress, adding layers of wool stockings and petticoats. Her muscles protested every movement, still aching from the cold, but she pushed through the discomfort. This was too important to delay. She carefully wrapped the precious papers in oilcloth and tucked them securely in her pocket. The rest of the hymn book's contents she returned to their proper places between the pages. Whatever happened in town, she wouldn't let these documents out of her sight again. Theo returned, stamping snow from his boots. "Team's ready," he announced. "Got the sleigh loaded with extra blankets and furs. Even heated some stones to keep at your feet." The care in his preparations brought a warm flush to Hetty's cheeks. "You think of everything," she said softly. "Just trying to keep you safe this time," he replied, helping her into her heaviest shawl. "No more freezing in the snow, you hear?" The morning air bit sharp and clean as they stepped outside. Fresh snow blanketed the world, pristine and glittering. Theo's team stood ready, their breath steaming in the cold. He helped Hetty up into the sleigh, tucking fur robes around her until she was cocooned in warmth. "Comfortable?" he asked, placing the heated stones at her feet. "Yes," she answered, clutching her precious pocket where the papers lay hidden. "Let's go show the judge what kind of men he's dealing with." Theo smiled grimly as he took his seat and gathered the reins. "That we will, Hetty May, that we will." The sleigh bells jingled as they set off down the mountain trail, heading toward town, and whatever justice awaited them there. Hetty's heart was lighter than it had been in months, despite her lingering weakness. For the first time in years, she had both hope and a champion to stand beside her. Dawn painted the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Theo's sleigh glided into Pine Bluff. The courthouse loomed ahead, its weathered boards frosted with morning ice. Hetty clutched her hymn book close, drawing strength from its familiar weight. The precious papers inside felt like burning coals against her chest. Theo guided the team to a halt, his breath clouding in the crisp air. "Ready?" he asked softly, helping Hetty down from the sleigh. She nodded, though her knees trembled beneath her heavy skirts. Already townsfolk were gathering on the courthouse steps, their whispers carrying on the winter wind. Some pointed, others turned away, but Hetty kept her chin high as Theo offered his arm. Inside, the courthouse chamber felt as cold as a tomb. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the pine walls, and the wooden benches creaked as curious spectators filed in. Near the front, the railroad foreman sat with his lawyer, both men in fine suits that seemed to mock Theo's simple buckskins and Hetty's patched dress. The foreman's smile was sharp as a knife when he caught sight of them. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man and his charity case," he drawled, just loud enough to carry. Theo's arm tensed beneath Hetty's hand, but he said nothing, leading her to a bench near the front. The courthouse filled quickly as word spread through town. Hetty recognized faces from the church social. Mrs. Carver offered a gentle smile, while others watched with undisguised curiosity. At precisely 9 o'clock, the judge entered. He was a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily swayed. The room rose, then settled, as he took his seat behind the heavy oak desk. "Water rights dispute," he announced, shuffling through papers. "Railroad claims deed to creek water on Boone property. Let's see your evidence." The railroad's lawyer stepped forward smoothly, producing a document with flourish. "Your Honor, we present a properly executed deed, signed by Theodore Boone himself 3 years ago, granting full water rights to the railroad company." The foreman's smug expression grew as the judge examined the paper. Hetty's heart pounded so hard she feared everyone could hear it. Beside her, Theo sat straight and calm, his weathered face betraying nothing. "Mr. Boone," the judge called, "you deny signing this deed?" Theo stood, his voice steady and clear. "I do, Your Honor. Never signed away my creek rights to any man or company." "Can you prove your prior claim?" "Yes, sir, I can." Theo gestured to several men seated nearby, trappers and homesteaders Hetty recognized from their evidence-gathering ride. "Got witnesses here who've known that creek as my water source since I first built my cabin 12 years ago." One by one, the witnesses rose to testify. They spoke of helping Theo dig his well, of watering horses at his creek during hunting seasons, of the careful way he maintained the water flow for downstream neighbors. Their words painted a picture of a man who lived honorably on his land. The railroad's lawyer tried to shake their testimony, suggesting bribes or confused memories, but the trappers stood firm. These were men who lived by their word, and their simple honesty carried weight. Still, the judge frowned over the conflicting claims. "The deed bears what appears to be your signature, Mr. Boone, without clear proof of forgery." "Your Honor?" Hetty's voice surprised even herself as she rose on shaking legs. The packed courthouse fell silent, all eyes turning to her. She clutched her hymn book like a shield. I have evidence that might help." The judge peered down at her. "And you are?" "Hetty May, Your Honor. She glanced at Theo, drawing courage from his steady presence. "I'm staying at Mr. Boone's cabin while he helps me through hard times." Snickers rippled through the crowd, but the judge silenced them with a sharp look. "What evidence do you offer?" With trembling fingers, Hetty opened her hymn book and withdrew the carefully wrapped papers. "These are my marriage documents, Your Honor, and records of my dowry land. The same railroad company claimed they bought that land from my late husband, but—" She stepped forward, extending the papers. "These prove he never had legal right to sell it. The property was still in my name." The judge took the documents, studying them in the lamplight while the railroad men shifted uneasily. Hetty's voice grew stronger as she continued. My husband. He drank with land agents, signed papers he had no right to sign. Just like that deed with Mr. Boone's name. It's forged, Your Honor. They've done this before, claiming rights they never properly bought. The courthouse erupted in murmurs. The railroad foreman's face had gone from smug to thunderous, but he held his tongue as the judge examined Hetty's papers. These appear genuine, the judge said at last. Marriage certificate, property deed with official seal, and… He held one document closer to the lamp. Notation from the county clerk confirming the land was never legally transferred. He looked sharply at the railroad's lawyer. This suggests a pattern of fraudulent dealings by your company, counselor. The lawyer sputtered, but before he could speak, the judge continued. I've seen enough. This court finds the railroad's claim invalid. Water rights to the creek remain with Theodore Boone. The gavel crack echoed like a gunshot through the chamber. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The railroad men gathered their papers and stormed out, the foreman's face dark with rage. But Hetty barely noticed them. Her legs had gone weak with relief, and she sank onto the bench as friendly hands reached out to congratulate them. Mrs. Carver was among the first to approach, her aged eyes bright with tears. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she said, squeezing Hetty's hand. Sometimes he sends angels in unexpected packages. More neighbors crowded around, the trappers who'd testified, women from church, even the storekeeper who'd once ordered her away. Their words of support and approval washed over Hetty like warm rain, beginning to heal years of shame and rejection. Through it all, Theo stood beside her, his solid presence anchoring her against the tide of emotion. When the well-wishers finally dispersed, he helped her gather her precious papers. You did it, he said softly, tucking the documents safely back into her hymn book. You saved both our lands with your courage. Hetty looked up at him, seeing pride and something deeper shining in his eyes. We did it together, she corrected gently. Just like you said. We fought together. Outside, morning sun had burned away the frost, and the courthouse steps no longer felt quite so steep. Theo helped Hetty into the sleigh, tucking the furs around her with familiar care. As they drove away, the sound of their victory seemed to ring in the sleigh bells' cheerful song. The courthouse steps emptied slowly as folks lingered, their attitudes toward Hetty transformed like frost melting in morning sun. Where there had been sneers, now came shy smiles. Where there had been mockery, now came murmured congratulations. Even those who had been cruel seemed touched by her courage in standing up to the railroad men. Mrs. Ruth Carver made her way through the dispersing crowd, her silver hair catching the weak winter light. She took Hetty's hands in her own weathered ones, her grip warm and sure. My dear, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, you've shown us all something today. God uses the humble to shame the proud. Never forget that. Hetty felt tears prick her eyes at the older woman's words. For so long, she had believed herself worthless, a burden to be borne. Now, standing in the aftermath of victory, she felt the first stirrings of true dignity in her heart. Theo stood nearby, speaking quietly with the trappers who had testified. His broad shoulders were relaxed now, the worry of recent days lifted from them. When he turned and caught her eye, his smile warmed her more than any fire could. Ready to head home? He asked, offering his arm. Home. The word settled in her chest like a prayer answered. She nodded, taking his arm and letting him guide her down the courthouse steps. Outside, the afternoon had turned magical. Delicate snowflakes drifted through shafts of pale sunlight, each one sparkling like a tiny star. The air was crisp but not bitter, carrying the promise of evening peace, rather than night's chill. Theo helped her into the wagon with careful hands, making sure she was settled before climbing up beside her. As they started down the street, he cleared his throat. "Hetty," he said softly, "I need to thank you proper." She shook her head. "There's no need." "There is," he insisted gently. "You didn't just save my land today, you saved my hope." His hands were steady on the reins, but his voice held a tremor. "When that forged deed showed up, I feared I'd lose everything my hands have built. But you—" He glanced at her, his eyes full of warmth. "You brought light back to my world." The wagon wheels creaked softly as they left town behind, the familiar trail to the cabin stretching before them. Snowflakes caught in Hetty's shawl, and she pulled it closer, aware of Theo's solid presence beside her. "Sometimes," she ventured carefully, "the Lord gives second chances when we least expect them." "Second chances," Theo echoed thoughtfully. "Reckon that's what brought you to my door that day. Though truth be told—" He paused, gathering his words. "That day in town, when I spoke of dreaming about your body, that weren't the whole truth." Hetty's heart skipped, uncertain whether to hope or fear. "I dream of more than that," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I dream of your soul beside mine, your voice singing hymns in the evening, your strength facing down whatever comes our way." He turned to look at her fully. "I dream of us together, making something fine and true." Hetty felt heat rise in her cheeks, even as tears of joy welled in her eyes. No man had ever spoken to her with such tender respect, such honest admiration. The tears spilled over, leaving warm tracks on her cold cheeks. "Now don't cry," Theo said softly, reaching to brush away a tear with his thumb. "Unless they're happy tears?" She nodded, unable to speak past the fullness in her heart. His hand lingered on her cheek for a moment before returning to the reins. The rest of the ride passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath the wagon wheels and the occasional snort of the horses. By the time they reached the cabin, evening was settling in, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of purple and gold. Inside, Theo built up the fire, while Hetty moved about the familiar space, lighting lamps and gathering what she needed for supper. Her hands knew their way around his kitchen now, finding spices and cookware without thought. Soon, a pot of rabbit stew bubbled on the stove, filling the cabin with savory warmth. They ate at the pine table, lamplight casting a gentle glow over their faces. Theo praised her cooking, as he always did, but tonight his words carried deeper meaning. Their laughter came easily, mingling with the lamp's soft light and the fire's steady crackle. Here, Hetty realized, was the belonging she had yearned for all her life. Not in spite of who she was, but because of it. She watched Theo's face in the lamplight, saw the future in his gentle eyes, and knew at last that she was home. Dawn broke gentle over the Colorado highlands, painting the snow-covered peaks in soft rose and gold. A week had passed since the courthouse victory, each day deepening the rhythm Theo and Hetty had found together. This Sunday morning, the cabin glowed with warm lamplight against the lingering dark, smoke curling from the chimney into the crisp mountain air. Inside, Hetty moved with quiet purpose, her skirts rustling against the wooden floor as she set fresh cornbread on the pine table. The familiar scent of baking filled the cabin, mingling with wood smoke and coffee. Her hands, once uncertain in this space, now moved with the confidence of belonging. She had arranged wild winter berries in a tin cup as a centerpiece, their deep red bringing color to the simple table. The cabin door creaked open, letting in a burst of cold air as Theo returned with an armload of kindling. Snow dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves outside, carrying the first whispers of spring's approach. Each drop caught the morning light like a tiny crystal, a reminder that winter's grip was loosening day by day. "Smells like heaven in here," Theo said, stamping snow from his boots. He set the kindling beside the hearth, his movements careful and deliberate. Something in his manner seemed different this morning, a quiet intensity in his eyes that made Hetty's heart flutter. They sat down to breakfast together, as had become their custom. Hetty poured coffee into tin cups, while Theo sliced the cornbread, steam rising from its golden crust. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire and the steady drip of melting snow outside. When the meal was done, Theo pushed back his chair. Instead of rising, he turned to face Hetty fully. His expression held such tenderness that her breath caught in her throat. "Hetty," he said softly, then cleared his throat. To her amazement, he slid from his chair and knelt before her, taking her work-worn hands in his larger ones. His voice was rough with emotion but clear as a mountain stream. "When you came to my door that winter day, I thought I was offering shelter to a stranger. Didn't know I was welcoming my own heart home." He squeezed her hands gently. "These weeks with you have shown me what I've been missing all these years. Your strength, your grace, your faith. They've made this cabin a true home again." Tears welled in Hetty's eyes as Theo continued, his words plain but profound. "I'm asking you proper now. Stay here with me, not as beggar but as wife. Share my name, my land, my life." His eyes held hers steadily. "Let me cherish your body and soul the way the good Lord intended." Hetty's tears fell freely now, dropping onto their joined hands. Her heart felt too full for words, but she managed to whisper, "Yes." Then louder, joy breaking through like sunlight. "Yes, Theo Boone, I will be your wife." His face lit with a smile that warmed her to her toes. He rose, drawing her up with him, and wrapped her in an embrace that felt like coming home. They stood there by the morning fire, holding each other, two souls who had found unexpected blessing in each other. The day passed in a golden haze of joy. They attended church services, where news of their engagement spread like wildfire through the congregation. Mrs. Carver wept happy tears while hugging Hetty, and even those who had once scorned her offered congratulations. Evening found them back at the cabin, where lamplight cast warm shadows on the log walls. The fire crackled low in the hearth as they sat together in their familiar chairs. Without discussion, they began to sing, their voices rising in harmony with an old hymn. Hetty's clear soprano twined with Theo's deeper tones, filling the cabin with praise. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me." The words held special meaning now, speaking of their own journey from loneliness to love, from scorn to dignity, from broken to whole. Their voices carried the truth of it, that faith and love could indeed redeem the harshest frontier, could heal the deepest wounds. Outside the cabin's window, snow glistened in the falling dark, each crystal catching the lamplight's glow. Inside, warmth and joy filled every corner. Two once broken souls had found their way to each other, proving that God's grace could work miracles even in the wild Colorado highlands. Their love story would be told for years to come, the tale of a curvy widow and a rugged mountain man who found dignity, faith, and love in each other's arms. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.